They were already saying the Northerner would be buried alive in his own house before the winter was out, for no sane man on the open plains packed his home in a shell of the very snow that killed men, and here was a man banking his low cabin in deep snow until it vanished into a drift. In the autumn of 1887, on a windswept claim near a raw little settlement called Kettle Flats out on the open plains of the Dakota Territory, Jonas Thorne raised a low house of logs, and then did the thing the whole country took for madness. He banked packed snow up its walls and over its roof deeper and deeper as the season turned, until his home lay under an unbroken shell of snow like a grave heaped over, with only a low door and a thread of smoke to show a family lived beneath. Winter came early and mean and long to that high, flat country, and every sensible homesteader for 20 miles had built a tight stick cabin, set a good iron stove in the middle of it, and stacked a great woodpile against the wall to fight the cold. Here was the Northerner, burying his house in the one thing they all shoveled from their doors and feared, denning down under the snow like a badger. He would smother in that buried hole, or the roof would cave, or the damp would breed a sickness and carry off half his household by spring, they said. What none of them knew, and what the killing winter of 1888 would teach them to their cost, was that Jonas Thorne had read the cold and the snow better than any man in Kettle Flats, and had wrapped that low cabin in the one blanket that burned no wood and never, all winter long, went cold. He had come to that country carrying old knowledge and not much else. He was a lean, weathered, dark man of about 40, born on a hard-scrabble farm back east, but made by the years he had spent since in the far north, trapping the winter country where the cold came down harder and longer than any plainsman had ever felt it. Up there he had wintered among trappers and northern people, and more than once he had slept warm and easy in a house built of nothing but blocked and packed snow, while the open air a hand's breadth outside would have frozen him where he lay. He had never forgotten what the northern people knew and the plainsman did not, that snow, rightly used, is not the winter's knife, but the winter's blanket. He had married a steady, capable woman named Ada, and when he tired of the tripline and wanted land under him and a roof of his own, the two of them came south to take up a cheap claim on the Dakota plains, arriving with a wagon, a few tools, a shaggy trail dog that had followed him down out of the north, and a way of thinking about snow that not one of their new American neighbors would ever have guessed. For Jonas Thorne knew one plain thing in his bones, that the whole of his strange house was built upon, and the settlers around him had never had cause to think it through, because they had always fought the snow and never once thought to use it. It was this, that snow is not cold the way iron is cold, or the way the black night air is cold. A bank of packed, undisturbed snow is almost all of it trapped and motionless air, held still in 1,000 tiny pockets between the flakes, and still air is the warmest blanket there is, the same still air a wool quilt holds, or a bird's feathers, or the fur of a wintering animal. That is why the grouse dives into a snowbank to roost on the killing nights, and why a man buried to the neck in dry snow will keep from freezing while a man in the open beside him dies. A deep, unbroken shell of snow over a house does the same for the house. It holds the warmth inside against the cold outside, and lets it out so slowly that a very small fire, or in a pinch even the plain heat of the bodies within, can keep the inside livable while the world beyond the snow falls past 40 and 50 below. The plainsman saw snow only as the enemy, to be shoveled from the door and cursed and fought all winter long. Jonas Thorne saw it as the free, endless, self-renewing blanket, the winter itself, carted to his door and heaped there for nothing. And he meant to let it do the work no woodpile could. But knowing that snow is a blanket is one thing, and building a house that wears it is another. A shell of snow was no use to a freezing family if the wind stripped it away or the roof would not carry it, and so every part of Thorne's low house was shaped to take the snow and hold it and keep the heat beneath it. He built the cabin low and squat and close to the ground, so the drifts would climb it easily and the wind would pack the snow over it instead of scouring it off. And he roofed it not with bare shingle, but with a deep layer of poles and brush and sod, so the snow would lie thick and unbroken across the top and not melt through. Then, as the first snows came, instead of clearing them, he banked them, packing the snow by hand and shovel up the walls and over the roof deeper and deeper, into a continuous shell a foot and more thick over every part of the house, so no wall stood bare to the wind. He left only a low doorway, dug like a short tunnel through the bank so the wind could not drive straight in, one small deep-set window, and a single vent hole at the peak so the small fire could breathe and the air stay sweet. And inside he set only a small, plain iron stove and stacked beside it only a modest rank of wood, for he did not mean that stove to carry the house through the winter. He meant the snow to carry it, and the little fire only to help of a morning. So it had come to Jonas Thorne on the long road south, that if he built his home the way the North had taught him, low to the ground, roof deep, and banked over entire in a thick unbroken shell of snow, a tiny fire could hold it warm through the hardest winter the plains could throw on almost no wood at all. He meant to let the snow stand as the walls of his house, walls that cost nothing, that the sky itself delivered and renewed, that grew only thicker and warmer the harder it stormed. It was the plainest, oldest reasoning the cold North had, and he set out that autumn to build it on a Dakota claim. He began, to the settlement's mild approval, by raising the low, stout shell of a log cabin, and any homesteader riding by nodded to see it, for a man building a tight house before winter was only being provident, even if the house did sit uncommonly low to the ground. Then he did the thing that turned the nods to open disgust. Instead of shingling a clean cabin, shoveling his door clear, and stacking his wood high, he let the first snows lie, and then he began to bank them, heaping and packing the snow up his own walls with a shovel and his own 2 hands, shaping it higher week by week over the roof and the eaves until, in plain sight of anyone who cared to watch, his house disappeared. It sank under a smooth white mound with a hole of a door and a wisp of smoke, for all the world like a fresh grave heaped over, or the den some animal had dug itself into a bank against the winter. From the road it looked exactly like what the settlement said it was, a hole in a snowdrift where a man too mad or too strange in his ways to know better had buried himself and his wife alive. The disgust grew with every shovelful he packed on, and Jonas Thorne, who had slept snug under snow in country that would have killed every man laughing at him now, let them talk. The work of keeping such a house was constant, and that made the mockery worse. For to the people of Kettle Flats, the whole thing was an offense to every notion they held of how a decent family met a winter. The snow shell had to be kept whole, the tunnel of a door dug out after every storm, the vent at the peak kept clear so the little fire drew and the air stayed good. And a man had to go carefully, for a shell packed wrong could slump or breed damp. To the settlement it only proved the folly, the northerner fussing over his snowbank, digging himself out of his own door of a morning like a badger, living buried in a drift like something that ought by rights to hibernate. When a neighbor told him flatly that no sane man on the plains buried his house in the snow, that it was mad and low and a certain grave, Jonas answered, in his slow, careful way, that a fire went out, but a bank of snow did not, and that come the worst of the winter they would see which of them had built the warmer house. And the neighbor rode off certain the northerner had left his wits behind him somewhere out on the trip line. Jonas Thorne knew exactly why he had buried his house in the very snow they feared, and there was not another soul in Kettle Flats willing to see the sense of it. The mockery had a leader, and his name was Harlan Boyd. Boyd was the most prosperous man near Kettle Flats, a big, hearty, loud-voiced homesteader who had done well and liked it known, who held the finest house in the settlement, a tall two-story place of good sawn lumber, straight-walled and proud, and stacked against it every autumn the biggest woodpile in the country. A great wall of split cordwood he took a plain and open pleasure in. Like men of his sort in those confident years, he believed a man got on by doing things the modern, forward, sensible way. A good frame house, a good stove, a woodpile to be proud of. He had watched the northerner raise a low log cabin and grunted his approval. Then he had watched the man bury it whole under a mound of snow and move in under the drift, and something in Boyd took the sight as a personal affront. So Boyd led the laughter and did it in a big, carrying voice from his own fine porch. He would remark that the northerner had saved himself the trouble of dying by digging his grave and moving into it early. That Thorne and his wife would be found in the spring thaw, curled up like two frozen gophers in their hole, and that this was what came of a man living too long alone in the north among the animals. And the men would laugh, and it went round the country. Thorne, the madman who had buried himself alive in a snowbank to save the price of firewood. Jonas let them talk, for a settlement busy laughing leaves a man alone to work, and there was much still to do that none of them would have understood. He packed a snow shell deepest on the windward side, where the north wind struck, so the coldest quarter of his house wore the thickest blanket. He dug his doorway as a low crooked tunnel through the bank, and hung a plank door at the inner end and a hide flap at the outer, so a man passed through a pocket of dead-still air, and no gust of the killing wind ever reached the room. He set his one small window deep and double, a pane within a pane, with a space of trapped air between. So the little daylight he let in cost him almost none of his heat. He kept the vent at the peak just so, open enough that the fire drew and the air stayed sweet, narrow enough that the warmth did not pour out of it, and he laid up beside the stove only a short rank of wood, a fraction of the great cords the other men were splitting all autumn. For the wood was meant only to take the edge off a morning and cook the food, the long work of holding the house against 40 and 50 below he had given deliberately to the deep still snow packed over the roof. What the folks who drove past Thorne's buried mound of a house of a Sunday were laughing at and could not see was as sound a piece of cold country reasoning as the Territory had ever held. Every stove in that country roared hot of an evening and stood dead cold by the small hours, its heat pouring out through thin plank walls, and every man fought the snow all winter as his enemy, shoveling it from his door and cursing it as it fell. Jonas Thorne had done the opposite of each. The snow the others threw away, he had packed and banked over his house until it was walls and roof and blanket all at once, an insulation the sky delivered free and renewed with every storm. And behind that deep still shell of fire, no bigger than a cook fire, held the whole house warm through the deadest, most fireless hour of the night, because the snow would not let the heat escape the way thin planks let it pour away. It was a whole winter's cold answered at a single stroke, with the enemy itself made into the cure, and the whole of Kettle Flats drove past to laugh at it. By the middle of December, the country began to turn hard, and Jonas Thorne got his first real proof, though he was near the only man who marked it. A savage cold snap came down off the plains one night, the first true one of the season, the temperature falling far below zero, and the wind out of the north driving the frost deep into everything. In the gray of the morning, the homesteaders up and down the settlement woke to misery. Their stoves, fed until midnight, had burned out in the small hours and gone dead cold, and the frost had come straight through the thin plank walls and stripped the rooms bare, so their good modern cabins stood bitter, though the fire had roared the evening before, and every family rose shivering to build the fire again from cold ash, and every man marked, with the first small pull of fear, how far his great woodpile had already gone down in a single hard night. Jonas Thorne did not. He woke in his buried house to a room that was not cold, cool, but living, holding a low, steady warmth, with no more than a handful of banked coals left gray in the little stove, and lay a while in the dark, under the deep snow, warm. He rose and laid a bare hand flat against the inner log wall, behind which a foot and more of packed snow held out the killing night, and the log was dry and not cold to his palm, for the frost that had stripped his neighbors' cabins bare could not reach through the blanket of snow to his. His family had slept warm, and he had burned almost nothing to do it. It was working. There is a particular loneliness in being the only man in a country who believes a true thing, and Jonas Thorne had lived in it since the day he first banked snow against his own wall. On the clear, hard nights of that early winter, with the first proof behind him and the great test still ahead, he would sit in the warm, buried room with the fire down to coals and go back over the whole of it the way a man checks a sum he has staked his family's lives upon. There was no book for what he had built, and no neighbor who would grant it a grain of sense. There was only the plain old knowledge of the North, that snow is trapped still air, that still air is a blanket, that the deeper and the stiller the snow the warmer the thing beneath it. Everyone he could speak to believed the loud and obvious thing, that a man keeps warm by a stove and a great woodpile, the quiet thing, that the snow itself was the warmest wall he could build. Only he believed. He had decided long before, in a warm snow house in the far north, with the cold howling outside, which of the two he would trust when they disagreed, and he trusted it now, and slept warm on it while the frost cracked the ground outside. He told no one, for there was no one who would have believed him, and besides, Jonas Thorne had never needed the settlement to agree before a thing was true. He cut his modest rank of stove wood, packed a snow shell whole after every fall, kept the vent clear and the tunnel dug, and settled in with Ada and the dog to wait for the winter he had spent years in the north getting ready for. The settlement settled in too, its cordwood stacked high, its opinion of the northerner fixed. He was the madman who had buried himself in a snowbank, and when the killing cold came, they expected, in the way people expect such things without quite wishing them, to hear that the two of them had smothered in that hole, or frozen in it, or would be dug out dead come the spring. The killing cold came in the last days of January, and it did not come alone. It came as the very heart of the worst winter the northern plains had ever shown to living men, a winter spoken of for long years after. It began with a wind out of the northwest that dropped the temperature 50 degrees between noon and dark, and then it began to snow, and the snow did not stop. For 9 days the blizzard held the territory in its fist, packing the snow into iron drifts that swallowed the fences and buried the low sheds and cut Kettle Flats off from everything but its own hard endurance. No man could cross his own yard without a rope. Stock left out in it died where it stood, and the thermometer nailed to the settlement store, which the storekeeper watched with a kind of horror, fell and did not come back. It passed 20 below. It passed 30 below. It passed 40. And on the coldest black morning of that terrible stretch, the storekeeper wiped the frost from the glass and read it at 48 degrees below zero, and he had never in his life seen it fall so far, and he did not go out of his way to tell the few who were about, for he did not think a number like that would help anyone bear it. 48 below. At such a cold the ordinary rules of a plains winter stopped applying, and a new and merciless arithmetic took over. Dry wood burned with a thin, hurrying flame that seemed to give no heat at all against a cold so vast. The homesteaders of Kettle Flats, who had done the clean and decent and modern thing and set good iron stoves in their good stick cabins, found now what the modern way was worth at 48 below, that a stove at such a cold had to be fed without a single pause, or the frost took the room back in half an hour, driving straight through the thin plank walls, no matter how the iron roared, and that no woodpile, however high a man had stacked it in the golden autumn, stood high enough. They kept their fires roaring and wore their coats indoors and sat up in shifts to feed the stove, and watched their great cordwood piles shrink with a growing and private fear, and the storm did not stop, and the wood burned down. And all the while the snow they had fought and shoveled from their doors, all their lives came down without pause, and heaped against their thin walls and bare roofs, the enemy piling deeper by the hour, doing nothing for them at all, because they had never once thought to let it. In the low house buried in the drifts, the grave of snow the whole country had laughed at. Jonas Thorne and Ada were warm. They were not roasting, the room was not hot, but it was warm, steadily and quietly warm, and it held through the first day of the storm and the second and the third, and through all of it Jonas kept only the smallest fire in the little stove, a few sticks morning and evening, and let it fall to coals between, and the house stayed warm without it. For over the whole of that buried house lay a shell of packed snow, a foot and more deep, grown deeper every hour of the storm, holding the warmth inside as faithfully as a foot of wool. So slowly did the heat pass out through all that trapped still air. The frost that stripped the neighbors' cabins bare the moment their fires died could find no road through Thorne's snow to the warmth beneath it, and the very blizzard that was killing the country was, hour by hour, packing his blanket deeper and safer over his head. The harder it stormed, the warmer he was. It was the one house in the territory that the great snow made stronger instead of weaker, and it stood buried and warm in the dead middle of the worst winter the plains had ever shown. While a single stride beyond the snow the cold stood ready to kill a man in an hour. The storm gave him no reason to trust it and every reason to doubt, and still the deep snow held. The wind threw itself at the white mound of his house without pause, and only packed the shell harder and heaped it higher, so that where the neighbors' bare walls stood naked to the gale. Thorns grew a thicker coat by the hour. His days were given over to the small unending care the house asked, and nothing more, digging the tunnel of the door clear each time a drift closed it, keeping the breathing hole at the peak open so the little fire drew, packing hole again any place the wind had cut it to shell. The buried house was, against all the reason the settlement believed in, a warm and quiet place in the dead heart of the worst blizzard the plains had ever thrown. And the man who had dug himself into a snowbank like a madman moved about inside it in his shirt sleeves, while stronger, prouder, better provided men a mile off wore their coats to bed and watched the woodpile that was their only life go down and down. Jonas Thorne had carried a small thermometer down out of the north and hung it by the door of the buried room, and on the coldest black morning of the storm, the morning the store glass across the smothered flat stood at 48 below, he rose from the warm bed he shared with Ada and looked at it in the gray dark. The needle inside his buried house stood at 42 degrees above zero. 42 above. Not warm as a summer parlor is warm, but warm as a good cellar is warm. Warm enough that the water stood liquid in the pail, and his hands were sure, and Ada slept easy, and not a soul under that roof was any nearer freezing than in the mild days of October. And his little stove held only a few sticks burning low, not a roaring blaze, for the deep snow and not the fire was doing the work, and had all along. 42 above inside, against 48 below without, a gulf of 90 degrees held across a low log wall and a foot of packed snow, with almost no fire at all, in the worst blizzard the Territory had ever shown, held up by nothing in this world but a shell of the winter's own snow, banked deep and still over a buried roof. Jonas stood a while looking at the needle, then laid the flat of his bare hand against the inner wall, with all that cold and killing snow a foot beyond it, holding every scrap of the warmth in. And then he went and cleared the drifted vent at the peak, for that, and not any fire, was the true tending that kept his house. Up in the finest house in the settlement, the reckoning had come to Harlan Boyd. His tall, proud frame house of good sawn lumber, the envy of the country, drank cordwood at 48 below the way a big, drafty house does, its heat pouring out through every thin wall and tall window as fast as the stoves could throw it, and along about the 7th day of the storm. With the drifts to his eaves and his great woodpile, the biggest in the country, the one he had taken such open pride in, burned alarmingly low, and his stoves for the first time going gray between the feedings, the big, loud, forward-looking man understood that he was in real danger, and that the nearest safe warmth in that white and screaming world was in the buried snow-hole he had mocked all autumn from his fine porch. It cost him something to go. He waited until the cold had got a killing edge inside his own grand rooms, and his wood was nearly gone, then wrapped himself in every hide and blanket he owned, and put his head down into the wind and fought his way across the buried flat to the northerner's mound of a house, half frozen and not sure the man would even open to him. He found the smooth, white mound with its thin wisp of smoke, floundered down into the dug tunnel of the door out of the wind, and beat on the plank door at the end of it with a numb fist. And it opened, and warmth rolled out over him into the dark of the tunnel like something solid. Harlan Boyd stumbled through the low door into the buried room and could not speak at first. And it was not only the cold that stopped his mouth. He had come in out of a world of 48 below and blowing white into a still, warm, amber-lit room, and he felt the heat of the place stand steady all around him, a warmth such as he had not felt in his own grand house in a week, and he looked about for the great roaring stove that surely must be making it, and found instead a small plain iron stove with a few sticks burning low in it, no bigger a fire than a man would boil a kettle on. He stood staring at that small, quiet fire, and then at the low log walls with the deep snow packed silent beyond them, and understood at last, standing there thawing in the buried hole he had laughed at all autumn, what he had been laughing at. He had built a tall, proud house and fed it a mountain of split wood and very nearly died in it, and the man he had called a madman had buried a low cabin in the snow every plainsman fought, and sat warm in it on a handful of sticks. Boyd was quiet a long while. Then he took off his frozen hat and said the only thing there was to say. "You let the snow bury you," he said, slow, "and it kept you." Jonas Thorne said that it had, and Boyd, with the painful thawing coming into his hands, said lower that he had been a fool about the northerner and the snow both, and had said hard things he had no business saying, and Jonas Thorne, who had no gloating in him, only told him to come nearer the little fire and shut the inner door and stop letting the good heat out into the tunnel. He kept Harlan Boyd through the last days of the storm, and 2 other men besides who fought down the buried road once word got round that there was warmth in the northerner's snow house, and the low-buried room built for one small family held them all, and stayed warm through the whole of it on almost no wood at all, because the warmth was not in any fire, but in the deep, still snow packed over. The roof that cost nothing and only grew deeper as it stormed. When the wind finally broke on the 10th day and a hard, blinding sun came up over a white and ruined country, the men who dug their way up out of Jonas Thorne's buried house walked out warm and whole into a territory that had lost, in that 1 week, sheds and stock and woodpiles, and very nearly the lives of some of its proudest men. And hard men who had laughed all autumn did not laugh about the buried snow house any more. Harlan Boyd least of all. He went home to a cold grand house, and a woodpile burned down to chips a changed man, and in the spring, quietly, he came back down to the low house and asked Jonas Thorne to show him how the thing was built. The deep-banked shell and the tunnel door and the breathing hole and the low roof made to hold the drift, and Jonas Thorne showed him. Word of the warm buried house got around the country that spring the way the mockery had the autumn before, only slower and more thoughtful, for the winter of 1888 had cured a great many men of a great many certainties. Some few of the settlers, the poorer and the humbler, and the ones who had come nearest to freezing, swallowed their pride and banked their own cabins deep in snow the next winter on the northerner's plan, and blessed them ever after. Most did not. Most would rather stack a high woodpile and shovel their doors clean and keep the snow off their roofs and take their chances than bury their house like an animal. For a man's pride in how he lives runs deeper than his memory of one bad winter. But the ones who did lived warmer and burned 1/10 of the wood for the rest of their lives. And the story of the winter of 48 below. When the woodpiles burned out and the proud modern men very nearly froze in their fine tall houses, and the man who buried his cabin in the snow came through warm with every soul alive, was told around Kettle Flats for as long as there was a Kettle Flats to tell it. They had called it madness, and burying himself alive for banking his house in the very snow that killed men. While wiser and cleaner men built proud houses and stacked great woodpiles and fought the snow off their roofs all winter long, and in a way the wiser men had looked the wiser, right up until the cold asked its real question. For a killing winter does not care how fine a man's house is, or how modern his ways, nor how high the woodpile was stacked in the golden autumn. It asks only whether there will still be a living warmth in the house in the dead black middle of the night, when the fire has burned to nothing and the wood is gone. Jonas Thorne had built his answer out of the oldest and humblest knowledge the cold North had, that snow is trapped still air, that still air is a blanket, that the winter's own snow, banked deep over a low roof, is the warmest and cheapest wall a cold land ever gave a poor man for nothing. And when the great killing winter came down at last and asked its question, his answer was already there, banked deep and silent over his head, and it held. As the northern people used to say of the deep snow that buries the winter houses, it is a cold blanket, but it is a blanket still, and it keeps the one who lies wise beneath it long after every fire has gone to ash. Jonas Thorne had wrapped his house in the winter's own blanket, and on the morning it fell to 48 below, the deep, still snow banked over his roof gave the cold nothing at all to take.